Okay, welcome everybody to the PSIR faculty lecture series. I am delighted to introduce Ed Schatz, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at University of Toronto. He just came out with this new book, Slow Anti-Americanism, Social Movements and Symbolic Politics in Central Asia, which has a very provocative title, but a lot of really rich content as well. And I'm really excited to hear him talk. He has several other excellent books, some of which for me are really go-tos, including one on political ethnography, which is a compendium of all of the smartest and most reflexive political ethnographers in the industry, as well as a book called The Paradox of Power, which is about Central Asian politics, also a really excellent book. He has a number of other articles and is a real expert on Central Asia and particularly Kazakhstan. So we are really glad to welcome you, Ed, and I'm going to just turn the floor over to you.
That's great. You guys can hear me okay? I told, is it Professor Smith and Professor Schenk before we started that, we are working from home, although I wanted to be with you in Astana, Nur Sultan, as you can see. I'm doing my best here. But what this means is that you may hear teenagers in the background, possibly you might hear cats. Hopefully you don't hear anything other than that, but we'll do what we can and we'll roll with the punches, as we all have to do during these weird times. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's really great that that you've got such a terrific intellectual energy at NU. That's been the case over the years, as some in the room will know. I've been involved with NU and trying to stay in touch with all the great things that are happening in political science department in particular, but in the university more broadly. And it's just great to be back with old friends, even though we can't go visit, various restaurants near the second Death Star or whatever it was we were talking about there. Anyway, I look forward to the next time that we're all together. What I wanted to do is, I hope to engage in a bit of sort of more lively back and forth conversation, because I find that most useful and most enlightening. And selfishly speaking, I'd rather hear from you than hear from me. I know my thoughts. I don't need to hear them again. But just in the interest of getting people up to speed a little bit, I thought I'd cover the broad outline of the book. It's a short book. But it tries to pack in a lot. And so let me try my best to put a few things on the table. I'll give you a sense of the overall arc of the argumentation and the evidence that I use, and then just see where it goes. So I thought maybe I'd go for, 25 or 30 minutes. Does that sound good, Caress? Yeah. And if it gets, if anybody has questions in the middle, please feel free to interrupt me. So let me go ahead and share my screen, because I did a PowerPoint. I never do PowerPoints, but I don't know, I felt inspired. So here we go. Okay. So this is, as we've already established, the research based on a couple of decades of thinking about Central Asia sort of in multiple scales, trying to think about the ways that the international connects with the domestic and potentially connects with the much more local, though it's a lot less local than maybe some of the other things that I've been interested to do over the past couple of decades. It also tries to cover much of Central Asia, though for reasons that one can, we could talk about. Uzbekistan is largely outside the book. Turkmenistan is entirely outside the book. So it's really, in a way, a study of social movement types in Central Asia, but focusing on Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, okay? And as you'll see, instead of going country by country, what I'm more interested in doing is looking at different movement types and how they differently employ images of the United States as they begin to chart out their way forward. So let's talk a little bit about anti-Americanism just briefly, and sort of get to the point of the title, or at least what I'm trying to convey via the title of the book. So usual thinking about anti-Americanism, right? I mean, when the term is invoked, often it's in the context of, people burning flags, or it may evoke images of people who are doing violence or symbolic violence to things associated with the United States. The term may evoke images of dictators fulminating against the United States. So here you have Chavez, you have Ahmadinejad, and you have Putin. I chose their angriest pose that I could find in each case, which makes a point going forward. And this is sort of the normal way of thinking about the United States. And the idea is that, that there's such a wellspring of sentiment poised against the United States that a leader such as these three individuals cannot do anything but heed that public opinion and change bilateral relations with the United States. Okay, and that may be the story of certain kinds of cases, but what I'll suggest is that's kind of an outlier story, right? The normal story is much more boring, honestly, right? It's much slower. It's much more incremental, but I would suggest it's much more typical. Okay, so I want to suggest that the Chavezes and the Putins and the Ahmadinejads and the flag burning, all of these things, they do happen, but these are the exception rather than the rule. So there are a few shortcomings of the sort of normal ways of thinking about anti-Americanism, as I suggest in the book. The first thing is, political scientists, I don't know if you do it at NU, but we like to talk about selection bias, right? So if there's a selection bias here, it's focusing on instances of anti-Americanism that are really at the extreme here, right? The ones that are most visible, flag burning, gosh, especially for somebody who, like myself, grew up in the United States. What more do you need as a sort of symbol of violence against the United States? But those are the most visible, and the most common may be quite different, right? The second problem with normal thinking about the United States is that they kind of get the causal story wrong, I would suggest. And the causal story normally is something like this. Sometimes it's implicit, sometimes it's explicit, but it's essentially that for whatever reason, in country A, fill in the blank with whatever country that might be, Cuba before the revolution, Iran before the revolution, Venezuela, you fill in the blank. In country A, there is a rising anti-American sentiment, and it may be because on the one hand, people are reacting to foreign policies of the United States, and so they're offering a sort of rational hatred of the United States, right? Or a rational criticism of the United States. Or maybe because they're simply pathological, right? That there's some kind of weird reason that's rooted in emotion or something or precognitive, and that's the reason why they're poised against the United States. And as the story goes, because of this popular sentiment, as I suggested before, leaders want to do anything but heed popular opinion, and therefore they sort of change bilateral relations with the United States on a dime, right? So that's the normal causal story. The problem is that it doesn't work that way, right? We know that, first of all, in non-democratic, well, let's start with democratic context. Even in democratic contexts, there is a very problematic relationship between public opinion on the one hand and foreign policy on the other, right? Historically, in democracies, even in democracies, the foreign policymakers barely heed public opinion on issues of foreign policy, right? And actually, in fact, citizens in democracies are typically they typically defer to foreign policymakers on those issues of foreign policy, versus on issues of domestic policy, citizens are more typically, they insist on having a say, right? So if we shift this to non-democratic contexts, it's hard to see how popular opinion filters up into some kind of decision-making calculus on the part of foreign policy-making elites, right? At a minimum, it's a very complicated story that doesn't lend itself to these kinds of simple images that we typically get in these discussions. I'll get to one alternative, and that's what the book is about in a bit. A third problem with these, or third shortcoming of these normal approaches is that they often set an impossible standard for significance. In other words, if there are no flags being burned, if there's no change in bilateral relations change that happens on a dime, right, then it must not matter, right? Then we don't really care about anti-Americanism. And I want to suggest that this is a strange standard for significance. So let's take, and I'm not cherry picking here, I'm taking some fairly prominent people here, Peter Katzenstein and Bob Cohane, in a book from 2007 on anti-Americanisms in world politics. They offer the following, as you can see there: in view of the attention that anti-Americanism has received, it's surprising how little hard evidence can be found that anti-American opinion has serious, direct, and immediate consequences for the United States. Sorry, I cut off my screen here, on issues affecting broad US policy objectives. And to me, I mean, we could say a lot more here, but I'll just point out that serious, direct, and immediate consequences for the United States affecting broad US policy objectives, it's very hard for me to imagine which societal phenomena around the globe, with the possible exception of terrorism, would have any kind, could reach this standard of significance. Right. And so what I want to suggest, and the way I frame the book, is that it's about the more boring, the slower moving processes that nonetheless have cumulative significance. And I want to sort of take stock of that, of how that significance emerges over time and in sometimes surprising and profound ways. So what's the alternative? It's slow anti-Americanism. So I chose an image of a slow meandering river, which reminds us, and one of the standing metaphors in the book is geological, right? That there are slow-moving changes that can amount to quite a lot if you simply pay attention to the ways in which social, political processes, the ways in which images move over space and actually begin to have an impact in some distant destination, right? So it's a much slower process. And if you simply look at this river, maybe a lazy river, you may think nothing is going on here, but there's, as the ethnographers say, there's never nothing going on, right? There's always something going on, and it may be a slow process. So let's talk a little bit about what this is. Much of the book hinges upon a notion that I forward called Symbolic America, right? And so this is a cluster of resonant representations about the United States. And this cluster is multidimensional and it's polysemious. Okay, so multidimensional should be fairly clear what that means. It exists on multiple dimensions. Polysemious meaning having multiple meanings, right? And so what, for example, the US flag, the American flag, means to you is going to vary a lot, right? Depending on the context, depending on your individual predispositions, depending on your location, depending on a whole series of things. That doesn't mean that it lacks symbolic impact just because we all have different views, or that we have significantly different views on what it represents. It may in fact be quite powerful, in part because it can capture the attention of a wide range of people, and it can mean a lot of different things. Okay, so the book goes into some of that. So here, just a couple of quick visual images. And the things I tackle in the book aren't always visual, but I think this makes the point, right? So is the United States the land of opportunity? Sure, could be. But what if you're a Black man, right? Is the United States the impressive paragon of patriotism? Or is it a place that is interested in warmongering, right? Is the United States the beacon of liberty? Or is it, sort of, I don't know, liberty disappointed, right? Lots of different possibilities, and this hardly exhausts it. So along each of these dimensions, you can see positive, negative evaluations. You can imagine that any given individual might have a variety of different perspectives. The United States might in fact be the land of opportunity, but it may also conduct foreign wars. Right? You can be critical on one dimension, you can be laudatory on another dimension. All these are possibilities at play. Okay, so what do I do in the book? I'm just sort of trying to keep track of time. One of the things I do to sort of set up the discussion in the context of Central Asia is a bit of a, Caress will laugh, a bit of a data exercise and quantitative data exercise, but it does set the stage for the discussion, I think, that follows. And so here what I did was I looked at, okay, if you want to construct how people think about the United States over time, there are a variety of ways to do it. Public opinion polls might be one. You could look at particular symbols, might be another. What I ended up doing, and we could get into the reasons why if anybody's interested, is I looked at news reports covering the region and looked at how different actors covered in those news reports expressed through their behavior some kind of attitude about the United States, or actors broadly assumed to be associated with the United States at different moments, like the IMF or the World Bank in the 1990s, for example. And we just coded the, is it a strongly pro? Is it a pro-US sentiment being expressed through behavior? Or is it an anti, right? And so, there's a lot of stuff going on. There are a lot of different actors, and one could parse this out much more than I did if one were sort of a quantitative scholar and wanted to do this sort of thing. But here, what we have here, oh, here comes my first interruption. Hello. Oh, he's listening. Okay. Here, what we have is, I'll just point out a couple of things in this graph here. And you're just looking at the monthly average, the quarterly average over time from 91 to 2000, end of 2001. And in the first half of the decade of the 1990s, attitudes about the United States, they move around a lot, but they're basically above what we establish as the median line, right? Sort of a neutral. And then after 1995, we see it, it rises and falls, it dips and dives, but nonetheless, the average remains significantly below. Now, what happened in 1995? Nothing, as far as anyone can tell, happened in 1995, or at least nothing specific happened in 1995. So one of the things that I want to point out in the book is that the typical way of thinking about how people react to the United States is to say, oh, they started hating the United States when NATO bombed Kosovo, right, or bombed Serb positions in Kosovo, right? Amplified through the Russian media. I mean, events like that do matter, right? People started hating the United States when they came to Afghanistan, or when they committed atrocities at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, and these events do matter. It's not that they're an unimportant part of the story, but there's a lot more going on that's secular, that's hard to link to particular kinds of events, that really amount to the cumulative sense of maybe disappointment in the United States that begins to appear over time. So what happens in 1995? Third quarter of 1995, that changes so that we're really stay fairly below the median line for the rest of the period covered. We don't really know, but nonetheless, that represents a change worth noting. Okay, so what happens next? And this is really setting the stage here. This is the background for how different social movements begin to use Symbolic America in their own recruitment drives, and that constitutes, and what I'm about to talk about constitutes the bulk of the book here. Let me just briefly on this sort of theoretical side say that I turn to framing from the social movement theory. Some of you will probably have been become familiar with this. And framing theory essentially says that that social mobilizers, I'll get into Islamist mobilizers, human rights mobilizers, and labor mobilizers in the book, but mobilizers of any type need to use and deploy a frame to make sense of grievances, right? That human beings who get involved in a movement, whether it's a labor movement, or Islamist movement, or a human rights movement, or environmental movement, or any other kind of movement you can imagine, they clearly have grievances, but what significance they attribute to those grievances, and who they blame for their predicaments, and what course of action seems appropriate given their grievances, that is in significant part a product of the frames that are used by mobilizers, okay? And framers make choices. And some of those choices, as we can talk about if anybody's interested, work, and some of them don't work, right? And what I want to suggest here is that the United States as an image, so Symbolic America, amounts to what the social movement theorists will call a master frame, right? It becomes a set of resonant images that mobilizers can link up to. So when Islamists want to chart their own agenda, and we'll get into a couple of examples in a second, they can link up to the United States, because what that does is it makes their movement at least potentially a global one. Human rights actors, similar kind of thing, right? Link up to something global, in the United States, at least from the 90s, and then I would suggest much beyond, remains a touchstone, a symbolic touchstone. Get positive or negative, it remains symbolically powerful, and I think ever present. So, how are we doing for time, Chris Schenk? What do we got, like 5 more minutes or something, or?
You can really have as long as you want, but yeah, if you want to wrap up in 10 minutes, it's fine.
Okay, I don't want to bore people. So, and plus I'm
not boring.
more interested in hearing from people. Okay. So, okay, the book basically covers, and you should all read the book and, buy copies for your friends. But the overview is this, and the bulk of the interior chapters deal with cases of Islamist human rights and labor mobilization. Here, this is a brief summary of the kinds of things that are covered, and it's from the tail end of the book. But just to give you a sense of what I'm doing in the middle of in the interior chapters, first thing I do is I try to look at some of the variety that are Islamist mobilizers, right? On the notion that they're not all the same, and we know that. And of course, anybody from Central Asia will know that very well. Western audiences aren't always attuned to this fact, and they vary in a whole series of ways that I won't bore you with here. But in the principal way that they evaluate the United States, right? So Hizb ut-Tahrir, Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, both hinge their movement on a negative evaluation of the United States. Not to say vitriolic, right? I mean, it's really quite dramatic. The Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, which of course, has been banned. When was it now? 2016 or so? I can't remember. And then, is that about right? Somewhere in there. The IRPT had a more positive view of the United States, at least in its initial renderings. And what I'll suggest here is that as the image of the United States deteriorates over the course of the decade, on aggregate, right? I mean, we're not saying that Central Asians are uniformly, poised against the United States. That's clearly not the case. But there is a noticeable shift over the course of the 90s and beyond. As that happens, these two, Hizb ut-Tahrir and the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, they find that their movement efficacy benefits, right? In other words, their ability to get their message out, their ability to recruit followers, it is impacted by a whole series of things. But the resonance of their message actually or their message is amplified to new audiences, and they gain new sympathizers, even if not necessarily, certainly not in the case of the IMU, new members, right? But with Hizb ut-Tahrir, we certainly see new membership just exploding as evaluations critical of the United States become much more prominent. The IRPT is different though, right? Because it's sort of hitched its wagon to a positive evaluation of the United States. The United States is the place where, in their estimation, where religion and state are separate, and the calculation there is that if we want to have space for devout Muslims to practice their faith, then we need to protect those devout Muslims from the encroachments of a state, right? So it's kind of a vision of American-style secularism, adapted for local circumstances to a degree. But nonetheless, a positive or at least neutral evaluation of the United States. But then that becomes a liability for the IRPT, right? As the United States comes to be seen as, well, maybe not that sort of laudable, that actor that we want to emulate, right? As we start to see questions emerge about its conduct of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and especially as the discussion begins, of course, it continues to this day, about possibility of a military intervention in Iran, right, with its cultural connections to Tajikistan, it becomes very hard to continue to have a positive evaluation of the United States. And so that initially positive evaluation becomes a liability for the IRPT. And you can see a signal shift in how they begin to craft their message. So a lot more discussion about Turkish Islam. Remember when the AK party in Turkey was considered to be the model for reconciling democracy and piety, and not implausibly so. I'll suggest, though it obviously has taken a turn in a very different direction. And notions of Euro-Islam rather than American versions of kind of secularism begin to enter into the IRPT's discourse. Okay, and this becomes a challenge as they try to pivot. And there are lots of reasons for the fate of the IRPT that we have seen, and so I don't want to reduce it to this evaluation of the United States as a liability, but I do think that plays into the role here. The second area that I look at in the book is human rights mobilization. And here I just, in the table, I divide it into democracy protesters and transnational advocates, which I see as having a different dynamic we can get into later. But the essential, the central argument is that, as the U.S. becomes, as people become more critical of the United States, human rights actors of various kinds find it difficult to frame their movements in sort of global terms, right? Because there's been this fusion in the 90s, basically is cast the die, I would suggest here. There's been this fusion of the United States as, the driver of a global human rights regime and some notion of universal human rights. And obviously anyone with a more sophisticated notion or understanding of, let's say, American history would see that this is problematic, but nonetheless, that's the message as it filters into these kinds of discourses, at least initially. And so human rights advocates have a harder road to hoe as they begin to see that this ostensible paragon of virtue, right, becoming, more tarnished. Right. And so again, just like the IRPT, they have to pivot. Now, some of them have to pivot more, right? And some of them have to pivot less. The transnational advocates, these are people who are, because they really don't rely on mass mobilization, they don't need to do as much. They can continue to avail themselves of, of human rights conventions and on commitments on the parts of states to have monitoring and of trials and things like that. But it does get harder, and interviews across the region suggest that among lawyers, Alexei will know this very well. It becomes very hard to continue to push for human rights when human rights, just as a phrase, becomes tarnished. Even if people on principle would believe in human rights protections. Finally, labor. Labor is the subject of the final interior chapter, and there it's actually an interesting story of how mobilizers didn't use the master frame of the United States. Very little reference to the United States that I could find. And here, labor, activism. We all know that it's labor activism is, in a comparative sense, fairly weak, although the clear exception here is Kazakhstan, where you see a lot of labor mobilization, most of it kind of informal or in the kind of gray zone, wildcat strikes, lots of different efforts to organize that are thwarted by dirty tricks one could get into. We're recording, right? But in any case, there are lots of reasons why the ability of labor to mobilize is somewhat limited. But what is fascinating to me is that the labor leaders and those who I spoke to, were very aware of the United States as a potentially powerful symbolic kind of actor, and yet they wanted to stay away from that. They chose not to plug into the master frame of the United States and symbolic America. And to my mind, and the chapter goes into it, and we can talk about it, to my mind, that was an opportunity missed by these mobilizers, because I think that used well, this kind of framing can actually enhance the efficacy of your movement. Okay, so that's kind of, in a nutshell, the interior chapters. I end the book with a kind of, what is to be done, right? In classic Leninist, Chernyshevsky sort of tradition here. What is to be done, right? If you're thinking from the perspective of Washington, does any of this matter, right? I mean, obviously, if people are taking to the streets, fomenting revolution, changing bilateral relations with the United States, invading foreign countries, well, then there's something that's to be done. But these slower moving processes, what do they call for by way of foreign policy change, let's say in Washington? So the first possibility is, well, nothing needs to be done, or maybe there really is nothing to be done. And you certainly get this from certain quarters. It's not the argument that I would make, but the idea is that it's really too expensive and too cumbersome a process to try to change how people around the globe, or try to affect, not change is too strong, to try to affect, if only at the margins, how people think about the United States. Too tall an order, too expensive, die is cast, nothing can be done. We can talk about that as an alternative. I think that's probably not useful. At least the research that I've done suggests that doing nothing certainly doesn't help. Okay. Second possibility is change the message, right? And here, I don't focus on that in the final chapter. I'll focus on the messenger, because I find that, the message, sort of those who are involved in soft power, those who are involved in public diplomacy, they often get the message right. They often are pretty good at depicting the United States in a positive light and trying to get that message out. The problem with the message, of course, is the distance between the message and, or the gap between the message and how people actually apprehend that message, right? So it may be that you can say that the United States is a place of religious tolerance, and that, any good Muslim across the world should be thrilled to emulate the American model of separation of religion and state, for example. But if people have been socialized to, or have grown up in situations where that simply will not ring true, I'm not sure that that message is going to fall on deaf ears, right? I think there's a lot more wiggle room, and one of the things I do in the final chapter is do a little survey experiment, which gives evidence suggesting that this is what's going on. That who the messenger is probably matters as much as what the message is, right? And one of the things we do is we do a little survey experiment where, at the time, we attributed a quote that was very positive about the United States to George Bush, right? Who, if you remember, was not terribly popular because of the wars and so on. And we varied that attribution, in some cases to Bush, in some cases to the ambassador, to Kazakhstan in this case, and in other cases, to a named but ordinary American, right? And we give him a name, right? And what we found is that the message coming from the ordinary American actually has a small impact in a positive direction, right? It all should have a positive impact, right? It's a positive message about the United States, but if you attribute it to George Bush, it actually goes in the opposite direction, right? So there, who the messenger is can either accentuate narratives about US hypocrisy, or it can begin to shift things in a direction that you would find important. So it's not just change the messenger, but change the messenger in a way that establishes his or her credibility. That and that might mean a variety of things. And what the US is trying to do, what the US pretends to stand for, into a local idiom, as it were, that makes sense in local kinds of contexts. And if that translation process is fraught, then it may be that there's some sort of reckoning that needs to happen with what the message is in the first place, right? why is it that it's being received so poorly? But changing the messenger, the research suggests, can make a bit of a difference. Finally, I'll suggest this, and then I want to hear from you guys. I think that there's a broad need to, I'm thinking about this even this morning as there's discussion, at least in the New York Times, about should the U.S., as it withdraws its forces from Afghanistan, should it look for new basing arrangements in Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, maybe Uzbekistan, right? I have my suspicion that that won't happen, but I would suggest that if there's any thought to doing that, there should be a thoroughgoing impact assessment, like you would do an environmental impact assessment before you build a pipeline, right? Or before you build a dam, right? There should be a thoroughgoing impact assessment on what the likely effect is going to be in terms of how the United States is received on the ground. I think this is a non-trivial thing. It lends itself to longer term thinking, which U.S. policymakers are not always great at. But that's what the research suggests ought to be done if you're concerned rather with the medium and long term, then that's really, I think, where it all needs to go. So I don't expect to be invited to speak to Washington anytime soon, but this is the message that I would deliver. Like pay attention to the longer haul, and you have some chance of influencing these processes, at least at the margins. Okay. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks so much, Ed. So we have lots of time for questions and discussion. And so if you have questions, you can put them in. I'm going to turn this over to Brian in just a second, but I do want to get one of my own questions in there. Since I got to introduce, I get to also nose my question into the front of the line, because I'll have to scoot off to a conference in a few minutes. But there's lots of time for questions. If you want to put them in the chat, please feel free to put them in the chat. Brian will read them out, or Ed will read them out. I'm sure Ed has questions that he'd also like to pose to the audience, or maybe not. That sounds like it's fun and interactive. But I just want to say that for me, the elephant in the room is media, kind of just mass media, and Russia, the Russian mass media. So in particular, I mean, it occurred to me as you were talking whether, oh, now it's my turn for the distraction. Whether diplomatic postures matter, right? So if, the posture of the governments towards America matters to how those people that are being mobilized will react to or engage with an anti-American sort of, or American or anti-American sentiment, right? Because people are socially and politically embedded. So they're going to be, there's so many multiple inputs that they're dealing with as they are being subject to mobilization, right? And one of the big factors is, I think, their own governments, of course, but just the Russian media, right? The pervasiveness and the continued pervasiveness of the Russian media. So I'm just kind of interested where that falls in the story, if there's, how we kind of fit that into the explanation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, great question. I mean, so let me tell you how I deal with it in the book, and let me tell you why it only hints at, an answer, right? So, I mean, in the book, I do look at change over time. For example, that chart that I put up, it gives you a sense of what the book covers. You can actually trace the coverage of the Russian mass media, right? And how it begins to evaluate the United States in different terms. Again, some of this is related to specific events. Much of it is not traceable to events that I can discern. But there is a clear pattern by which Central Asia continues to receive, one way or another, good or bad, its information about the world via, or at least largely via via sort of Russian lens. Now obviously people can get their information however they want to these days, within some limits imposed by different governments. But nonetheless, there's a great variety that's out there. But there's a longstanding pattern by which that you know very well because you live there is by which Russian, even things that appear in Kazakh or in Kyrgyz or in Uzbek may have their origins in Russian reporting to begin with, right? So they may look like, I don't know, an Uzbek language report, but especially as concerns the outside world. And this is not unique to Russia in the sense, I mean, you've got Russia with its oversized, it's got, the ability to cover the entire globe, right? Just as English language media have the ability to cover the entire globe. And so, you end up with different societies relying on that sort of thing. So that does mean that things get more complicated, especially depending upon what the Russian media is saying and how much it is at odds or not, I guess, with what the message might be from the diplomatic corps. But I do think here that this is, aside from the truly conspiratorial stuff that appears in this media, I do think that that's part of the ecosystem that you have to deal with, right? And that might mean even selectively engaging, if you're in the diplomatic corps or if you're somehow involved in public diplomacy, selectively engaging with the selectively here, right? Again, you don't need to give airtime to the truly nutty ideas, right? But engaging with the more nuanced discussions that are more critical of the United States than you would normally kind of see, and not shying away from those kinds of things. Now, I don't know how much effort for what result in the end, right? I mean, could you devote your entire life to this and have absolutely no impact given the overwhelming role of the Russian media? Potentially. But I think that actually one of the things that's actually most effective, and I didn't cover this in the book, but I do have an article that sort of covers this, is that delivering messages, right, in some kind of a unidirectional way without any kind of opportunity for discussion, that seems to, can have a little bit of an effect, but that effect may not last very long, right? But engaging people in discussion, right, where you legitimately hear people out, right, and you allow people to come to their own conclusions, and you don't have a predetermined outcome that you need them to hear this message, right? That actually can have a greater effect, right? It can soften the edges of unfounded criticism, or criticism that's unfounded about the United States. It can begin to poke small holes in the truly conspiratorial kind of thinking about the United States. And whether you can scale that up or not, I don't know, but I think it can be fairly effective, at least in small group settings. So there need to be an army of people doing this kind of work for it to be effective. But let me shift a little bit, because I think that there are other opportunities here. There was a case recently in Kyrgyzstan of a desperately sick individual who needed to be flown out for medical care. And I don't pretend to know the ins and outs of the stories and its possibilities, but it's played itself out in the local media, as far as I can tell, as a story critical of the United States. The U.S. has, this family applied for some kind of special visa for emergency medical care, and it was denied by the U.S. Embassy. Now, what were the opportunities? I don't know, but the optics here, right, are really quite negative. It looks like the United States is callous, and it's playing itself out in that media. Now, there was an opportunity there, right? And I don't want to instrumentalize everything, because that's not the way to go. But nonetheless, there was an opportunity there via one very visible instance, make a lot of positive waves, right, across Kyrgyz society. And, that's probably at a time when there's not a lot of that going on, right? And when you think about the U.S. image in that particular context. So again, I don't want to prejudge the outcome. It's hard to know what they were dealing with and so on, but nonetheless, it does strike me as a bit of an opportunity missed to demonstrate that the US can be not just a political actor, a military actor, an economic actor, but a caring actor, right? It's that the US is not indifferent to the plight of people on the ground. And I think that there are some ways in which that can be done. And I think it would make sense. Now, again, I don't want to instrumentalize that, because if you don't care, don't pretend that you care, right? That people see through that fairly quickly, right? If you're just going to instrumentalize it. But I think that, again, back to the messenger thing, training people to be caring emissaries of values, I think, is a sensible way to go. Yeah. Okay. I had one other thought, but I think I'll just stop right there and see what else people have.
Okay, great. So just to kind of smooth things here, if you want to speak, if you can just raise your hand and I can call on you, or you can post things in the chat. I see some chats already going there. But Neil was the first to approach the to get on the list. So he'll go first, then I'll try to weave in and out between speakers and chats.
Okay. Well, thank you. Right. Thanks for the paper. I suppose I want to reinforce your message, but from a different angle. I had a research project funded by the European Union about cultural and public diplomacy for the EU. And so as part of it, my research assistant and myself, we did surveys on how the media covered European issues. We took newspapers in Kazakh and in Russian, and obviously the Standard Times. And the overwhelming situation was that Europe was portrayed in a positive manner. Okay, so that was quite clear. But one of the things that I wanted to reinforce in relation to you, because this is all in Kazakhstan. Sorry, it was just Kazakhstan, but because there are so many European embassies in Kazakhstan, we were able to compare how they acted as messengers, and there was a very clear difference between how they did. Now, normally for me, a principle of history are the Brits are to blame, but in this case, I'd have to say that the British embassy, for example, I've forgotten her name now. She was the ambassador asked before this. So she had a Facebook page where she was learning Kazakh and talking to the people about Kazakhstan, etc. It's very, very popular. The German embassy did the Bundesliga, lots of stuff, had prizes for local football teams, etc., etc. And then some of the embassies completely ignored social media and simply put things up on their web pages, which there might have been notices they could have pinned to the door of the embassy, if you like. So the range of messengers was very interesting. And also, I think it had an effect. And I think that's more or less what you're saying, as well as the message, there's also the messenger. So anyway, sorry to ramble on about that, but enough.
No, that's great. And I mean, it would be really fascinating to try to tease out whether this difference makes a difference, right? I mean, Bundesliga, what was it, a competition or something like that?
Yeah, it was a competition, and the winner got a ticket to Germany to go to a game or that kind of thing. Okay.
I mean, like what, it's not clear that one single intervention like this, right? Essentially a lottery based upon people who are interested in sports, right? In soccer and football rather, whether that would make a difference. But it does suggest that an effort is being made beyond simply posting something to your, to a website, right? But again, I think all of these, and back to Caressa's good point, all of these are just drops of water in an ocean, right, of information. And so the question is whether it at all can be scaled up to make a difference. And my suggestion would be, it may seem like none of this makes a difference, and one could talk about any individual intervention and talk about how trivial or how seemingly unimportant it might be, and it might be by itself, but that the sum total can begin to make a difference if it's done smartly over the period of sorry, decades, right? And then that's what we're really talking about, because people don't come to, thinking about Germany from a blank slate, right? They have, predispositions, who knows, prejudices, prior understandings, right? They have priors. And so to begin to shift that, if that's the goal, is at a minimum going to take a lot of exposure to new and different ideas. And so that's just a question of time. And one of the challenges, and this is the last thing I'll say kind of on this, is of doing this, in democratic societies, mounting these kinds of efforts, is that, well, you have the limitations of, political time horizons, right? Who wants to mount something over the long term? And then taxpayer sort of appetite for funding these kinds of things, which is also a non-trivial consideration.
Just as a small footnote, the European countries also had a diaspora they're able to work through, and the United States obviously doesn't have that parallel.
Okay, thank you, Neil. So Ellen put the first comment here, but she also has her hand raised. Do you want to read your comment, or is it something different?
Yeah, I added a new question, so I'll ask if I'm allowed. Yeah, thanks. Very interesting. Yeah, my question is about what kind of indicators you use to measure the efficiency of pro or anti-American stance, especially for movements that are a bit hard to size, like the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. I mean, Hizb ut-Tahrir has a website and they're very vocal. It's easy to find to find evidence of their stance. IMU also has a press service, I suppose. I'm not sure. And I'm particularly curious about the RPT, for instance, because, yeah, how do you measure the response of their members? And obviously, yeah, there are so many other factors that were under so much pressure in Tajikistan that the absence of membership or people leaving the party might be connected to a broad range of other factors. So that was my first question. My second question is I was a bit surprised to see labor unions there. So I mean, these are important social movements. But I can't hear you. Is it Ed? I could not hear what you said. Yeah.
No, sorry, I'm just trying to have an exchange with teenager number 2.
Okay.
So, anyway,
it's just like just quickly. So labor unions, because the United States is not really known for its, traditionally known for its labor unions, but I suppose European countries would be a better model for workers' rights. So I was a bit surprised. So if you could comment on that, thank you.
Yeah, that's great. No, really, really good question. So the answer, it's very hard, especially when you're dealing with movement. Well, any movement really, right? I mean, obviously, the more conspiratorial, the more difficult it is. The more conspiratorial the movement, the more difficult it is to get information on it, right? So, in spite of the fact that the IMU has a press service or had, I'm not sure if it still does. It's what internal communications amount to would be probably a more interesting kind of indicator. Hizb ut-Tahrir has this, as you described. The IRPT. So I looked at the any kind of reference to the United States in the, and I'm blanking on the name of it, in the party newspaper over the course of whatever issues I could find. Right. So this is the spottiness of it, right? Because it wasn't digital, and so it became a question of what I could gain access to, and just tried to do so. A couple of things. Tried to look at how those depictions may have changed over time, whether they had become more critical or whether they had become less frequent, right? And one of the things that happens is they do become less frequent over time as this more general decline in attitude about the United States begins to become visible in the broader population. You begin to see references to the United States become less frequent. Okay, there's an interpretive moment there, which I interpret as consistent with the overall thrust of the book. but if one wanted smoking gun evidence, that's not it. And also not it is interviews, though I did a lot of interviews with activists. And I don't recommend taking a couple decades to write a book, but one of the advantages of taking a very long time is that you can go back to some of the same people and interview them again, and begin to understand how their understanding of whatever you're interested in might have shifted over time. And so that certainly happened in the interviews that I had with different activists. And these are more, there's some with the leadership, and we could talk separately, we can name names, but mostly this was with kind of rank and file people. And trying to do that at different moments in time, I think allows for a sense of how things might have shifted. But there is a bit of connecting the dots, and a fully embedded ethnographic study would have been the way to go. That wasn't going to happen in this particular case. Not the least of the reasons is because I don't speak Tajik. So we needed you, Helen, for that. But on the labor question, so the claim that I make is that at a moment of global economic neoliberalism, that there is an opportunity, missed opportunity in the context of Kazakhstani labor activists to hitch themselves to a discourse critical of the United States for fomenting this neoliberal order, right? And you do see this mounting easily by the late 1990s, right? It becomes more robust a discourse in the 2000s and beyond. So it's not that the U.S. is the site of great labor activism. All you have to do is look at the vote of where was it that they voted down Amazon organizing in the Amazon plant? I can't remember which state that was in now. Alabama, is that right, Alexei? Yeah. So I mean, labor has been systematically undercut in the United States, but that actually would lend itself to a critique of the United States, right? And using the U.S. as a symbol of everything that's wrong with the structure of the global political economy, I think is something that we might have reasonably expected of these activists if they were trying to gain momentum for their movement. So that's the claim that I make. It's a bit of a counterfactual in the sense that they didn't do it, and so counterfactuals are challenging intellectual exercises, but it I think emphasizes the point that just because a master frame is available to people, to activists, to would-be organizers, doesn't mean they necessarily use it. So there's this moment of agency that I wanted to emphasize.
Thanks.
Okay, great. So we'll go to Carol, and then we'll go to the next chats.
Hi, Carol.
Hi. It's nice to see you. It's been a few years. Anyway, what I wanted to ask about is two things. So first, when we think about the kind of angry strongman anti-Americanism that you started your talk with, we're talking about countries for which the United States is very important. Cuba, Venezuela, Russia, Iran, countries that depend, that future prospects of which depend on what the US does. Central Asia is different. Here, Russia, especially China, increasingly are much more important. The United States is relatively less so. So wondering how that might affect the kind of anti-Americanism that we see in different parts in the world. And relatedly, I was wondering if that perhaps suggests that there are distinct kinds of anti-Americanism that happen in different places depending on the specific conditions. And I guess one way of framing this is that perhaps your focus on Central Asia, in a way, also selection of Central Asia biases your results. But the reason I bring it up because I was quite struck by the language that you use in the talk and how you conducted your the project, which is, all this talk about selection bias, causation, I think understood in the way in which contemporary political science tends to think of causation, and you doing a survey experiment. That's very, very different, seems to me, from the kind of approach to doing political science that you previously, expressed, notably in your previous co-authored book. So I was wondering if you could speak to how, well, to what degree and how you're thinking on what good political science is, how your thinking on the topic has evolved over the years.
Okay, look, that's great, and Carol, great to see you. We should catch up at some point. Carol, having gone through the University of Toronto program and survived, or not, as the case may be. So let me start with the second question. Am I doing political science differently? Marginally so. I mean, maybe, I would encourage you to, if you have time and interest, to have a look at the book and see if on the whole it's different. I would suggest that it's not. I do have a methods appendix where I try to explain, I try to sort of characterize how I approach the topic. My view has shifted in a tiny way, I would say, over the decade or two. I've become, I've always been a pluralist at heart, but I tended to practice myself, exclusively qualitative kind of work and ethnographic or ethnographically inflected kind of work, for sure. I don't think that that's gone here. In fact, I think that's the major driver of what I'm doing here. What I suggest in the appendix, and you tell me if you think it's compelling or not, is that the overall logic of the project is essentially ethnographic. I'm trying to get a sense of the ways in which people on the ground view their own predicaments and the kinds of meanings that they attribute to those to their own situations, right? For limited exercises, and I did present 2 of them today, so it could be a little bit misleading, but for limited portions of that, where there is a fairly well-defined question that lends itself to, thinking in that kind of causal terms, I did something different, but really only to evaluate small points. One of my critiques of the kind of experimental turn in political science is that, yeah, they can, have terrific causal identification strategies, and they can do, they can establish causality, but they're typically dealing with microscopic kinds of effects, right? And so that may be important. And for me, it was important to get a handle on that tiny little piece about, the role of the messenger, because I wanted to figure that out. And the best way to do that, or really the only way, is to, in the context of this study, was to do it through this survey experiment. But I did not, but it's just to try to, so it's like one small piece of the much larger puzzle. So anyway, that's for you to judge, should you end up reading the whole book. The first question, yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. I do think that there's something to the states that matter can become states that have robust and multidimensional engagements with I'm saying hello to my wife, with the United States, sometimes conflictual, sometimes not. This issue becomes much more salient. So I do think that there's something to what you're suggesting, but it gets really messy. Like, so for every Venezuela, there's also, with its relations with the United States, which at least on oil, for example, for a while was pretty robust. There's a Mexico, right? Where you do see something that's different. It's conditioned by having a common border, having, migration kinds of questions in spades with the United States. But the kind of anti-Americanism that we see is not the flag burning, dictator fulminating kind of anti-Americanism. It's not. And but images of the United States do matter in Mexican politics, enormously so. Same thing for Canada, right? I don't know what the anti-American Canadian political party would be. Maybe there's an opportunity there for an entrepreneurial soul. But so far it hasn't materialized, at least not one that would foreground this. That said, there's mostly quiet critique of the United States that's an ongoing currency in Canadian politics, right? So I think I don't know. Picture gets extremely messy when we talk about those that have direct and ongoing, intimate, multidimensional relationships with the United States. So I don't think it's just the ones that are, you know, far from the United States that where this story that I'm describing plays itself out. I think it cuts a variety of ways.
All right, I'm going to ask a couple questions from the chat. Can you speak more about, you were just speaking about it, but Chopin asks what type of research methods you used, and Juldiz asks what were some of the major problems or issues you faced during your research, since your topic is considering a new concept that hasn't been considered from the Central Asian perspective. So research methods and problems addressing this issue.
Yeah, okay, the great, was it Chopin, I think, asked the first question?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, no, I mean, great question. So here I tried to be, I mean, I would, if you have a chance to look at the methodological discussion, the reflections at the end of the book, that would give a fuller answer. But there, what I try to do is I give a sense of, you know, there are people who do terrific public opinion research on views of the United States. But it's terrific public opinion research with all the limitations of public opinion research, right? I find this to be a very multifaceted kind of phenomenon, and I was interested in dealing with those multiple facets. And I think it, you know, because I have a because I've conceptualized it as as a multifaceted phenomenon, I think it invites multiple methods, right? So to Chopin's question, you know, over the years on different projects, including this one, but not exclusively so, I've spent a lot of time in the region. Sometimes conversations relevant to this project would come up in the context of other projects. So I consider that data as well. I did a lot of interviews, qualitative interviews, in some cases very in-depth, in other cases, the 10 minutes that the person would give me, right, Alexei? You know the feeling. And so, you do what you can. So I wanted to be as eclectic as possible, Chopin. And then, of course, you've seen the sort of, the coding exercise, which I thought was an okay way to reconstruct change over time, given that, given the limitations of other kinds of approaches, and the survey experiment. Beyond this, there's a whole lot of relying on other people's accounts, and I'm so thrilled. I'm so thrilled to see so many of you guys here, because there really is now, more than there was 10 years ago, certainly more than 20 years ago, an army of terrific scholars working on different aspects of Central Asia. And so I relied from this project a lot more on people like Hélène and others working on Tajikistan for their work. It didn't used to be the case that we had this critical mass of scholars, and I think we should continue to grow it. But relying on their secondary accounts was also an important part. And I'm not shy about that. I don't apologize for relying on the great talents of others. I think that's an important thing. Juldiz asked. Sorry, no.
Major problems or issues you faced.
So, yeah, major problems. Okay, so I'll just mention a couple of things. I'm not sure where Juldiz would want to go with this. One of the things that one of the challenges, of course, is the challenge that I mentioned with Hélène, right? You can't embed yourself to the extent that that you would want to find sort of smoking gun evidence in multiple places at once at multiple scales. It's just the project trying to span multiple kinds of scales didn't lend itself to really the purely ethnographic work that would have been my natural inclination. So that's, I guess, one challenge. And the way I addressed it was by trying to get to the best possible vantage point for gathering evidence, even if not the ideal vantage point for gathering evidence. There were other practical problems. I mean, one of the things that I decided early on, we did a whole series of focus groups. That's something I forgot to mention to Chopin. We did a whole series of focus groups across Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan with different population cohorts and so on to try to get to their attitudes about foreign relations, locating themselves geopolitically and so on and so forth. And one of the things I decided early on was that somebody, who looks like me and speaks like me might not be the best person to be running these focus groups to the extent that we're talking about the United States. And so I ended up, so this would have been a challenge. I decided to as a part of the project, hire local researchers to actually lead the focus groups, right? With appropriate linguistic competence, cultural competence, and this kind of thing. And it's no guarantee of anything in particular, but we worked on trainings to try to make sure that everyone was on the same page. But having them involved, I think, was a subtler way to get at foreign relations than having the foreigner in your midst, right? Even if we're speaking in Russian or something else or Kazakh, I'm obviously not local, and so that was one potential challenge sort of evaded. The third thing is, or is this the fourth thing? I can't remember. Is talking about anti-Americanism. I try to talk about this phenomenon without naming it, right? Because I think once you name it, people come with prior understandings of what the term might mean. And so, back to Carol's good question, right? Have you shifted your essential epistemology? I think this is an interpretivist kind of, assumption. Like I wanted people to tell me or tell, in the case of focus groups, the scholars running those focus groups, tell them how they think about the world. And so we don't need to give it a label at the beginning, because this may generate a dynamic which is entirely different, but rather start from a position of listening to people. And then I'm comfortable at the end of the day calling something, symbolic America or that kind of thing. They never would have used that vocabulary, right? But if the United States comes up naturally, more organically in conversation, then to me, that's kind of interesting. So I don't know if that's where Gilles was going, but those are some of the issues faced.
Okay, a couple more questions from the chat, then we'll go to a hand raise. So Gulzada asks, if you're going to write this book, I guess again, what would you do differently? And Aset wants to know what he says. Thank you. Then why Central Asia? So what would you do differently? What would you do differently if you're writing the book today, and why Central Asia?
And the second person was Azat, is that right?
Aset.
Asat. Okay. So yeah, Gulzada, what would I do differently? I might have moved a little faster on the book. It took a long time, and there maybe are certain advantages to that, but it does lead somebody like me who's interested in these topics to a degree of anxiety. But will this ever get finished, right? That's one thing. I'm not sure that's where Gulzada was going with that kind of question. Yeah, Gulzada, I guess if I could do it again or differently. Well, there are two ways to think about this. One is, looking back, what might I have done differently? I think I would have wanted to be a little more creative about finding a particular sort of local, socially embedded context that I would have access to, where I could, what's really happening quite locally, right? The reality is I tried a couple of these things, and for various reasons, it didn't work out. Some of them practical, some of them political, and so on. But I think at some point I gave up on being creative, and so that's something that one could do differently. The second way to think about it is sort of going forward. If I were to rewrite this book or do this research again going forward, how might it look different? I do think that I'm okay with how I for the next couple of decades. I think explicitly talking about competing images, right, would make a lot more sense, and especially thinking about how the way that Central Asians think about the United States is, of course, conditioned by how they think about Russia, how they think about China, how they think about other kinds of major actors, or actors major in their lives, right? And so, increasingly, so it may be that this book is in a way kind of, it made sense for the moment of global US hegemony, but the more we're talking about multipolarity, a meaningful multipolarity, the more we should be talking about the ways in which images of China, images of Russia, images of, I don't know, Saudi or something, play themselves out across the region, because I think they too can become politically important, and they too can become, moments of mobilization for actors on the ground. You certainly see that with the China issue right now, right? Images of China, I think, do play into social mobilization in a variety of ways. You see it in Kyrgyzstan, to a lesser extent in Kazakhstan. Complicated, interesting story there, but that's, if I were rewriting for the future, that's what I would do. I think I got your name right. Why Central Asia? Why Central Asia? Because I became a Central Asianist. That's the short answer. But if the question is, why did I become a Central Asianist? I was a student of European parts of the Soviet Union when there was a Soviet Union. And frankly, when the Soviet Union fell apart and I was considering grad school, I was really much more interested in the non-European parts, because the Western Academy had paid very little attention to the non-Western parts of the former Soviet space. And so that's, a short version of why Central Asia, though I think a lot of it has to do with talented Kazakh language teachers at the University of Wisconsin, right, Alexei, who stoked the passion. And so that's why I ended up at least starting my initial work on Kazakhstan specifically. So why Central Asia? At this point, it's because I study Central Asia because I study Central Asia.
Okay, so we'll go to one hand raised. So Artyom, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Professor Smith. Professor Schatz, thank you so much for your lecture. As Brian Smith already mentioned, my name is Artyom. So I have kind of like two questions in one. So first of all, in my opinion, Central Asia would not be the most anti-American place in the world, at least at this point in time. So my question is not really as eloquent as some of the questions by previous speakers, and rather certainly non-academic, but I'm curious, what do you think, what's your opinion on the most anti-American country in the world today? And the sub-question would be, what if I were to travel to that country, say tomorrow, considering there's no pandemic? What kind of research design, or simply speaking, what would I need to do to understand the reasons why that particular country is deemed anti-American? Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Artyom. No. Central Asia is not the most anti-American. In fact, I think if you were to characterize the popular views on the whole, you wouldn't say it's anti-American at all. You'd say that there are clear elements of anti-Americanism, and there are certain population cohorts that may be deeply anti-American, but in the aggregate, it's people have mixed views of the United States, which makes sense, right? Because maybe there are things to certain ways in which to view the U.S. as a model, and other ways in which it's not, right? So you're absolutely right in the first part there. What's the most anti-American country around the globe? Well, I haven't done research on those other countries. I think that one of the challenges is one of measurement and methods, right? Because there's, again, like I said, public opinion polling. So, you could find out that, significant portions of the population in Iran or in the Palestinian occupied territories have views very critical of the United States. But the question then becomes, what does it mean to be anti-American? And my suggestion would be that there are a lot more moving parts than we tend to assume, right? If someone is anti-American, if someone espouses views critical of the United States in the Palestinian occupied territories, it may have something to do with, how would you distinguish between a well-founded critique of the U.S. on the one hand and being anti-American on the other, in some sense that, the idea is that it's not very well founded, right? In those kinds of cases, it might be very difficult to distinguish the two from each other. But let me just sort of take your question for on its face and say, well, if you wanted to go into the Palestinian occupied territory and study anti-Americanism, or study views of the United States, I would say much more broadly. First of all, I would say that on a matter of research methods, you should be open to the possibility of some degree of pro-Americanism, right? If we simply look at it through the lens of one end of a spectrum, then I think we're limiting what we potentially might see, right? So that, I think, even though you recognize that that views may tend strongly in one direction, it doesn't mean that there can't be other things going on. That's the first thing. The second thing to see is I would say, try to reconstruct change over time. And I don't know what exists for that part of the world, but you would want to see what changed at what periods, and try to reconstruct in response to what, right? The third thing, and I think this probably goes particularly for Palestinian occupied territories, let's say, right, is the role of primary and secondary socialization, right? Because I think at some point, the views of external powers may be so conditioned from such an early age that that's the main driver. It's not, what the United States does or does not do. If the United States could provide, $100 trillion in humanitarian assistance around the globe, and if socialization, is much more critical of the United States, then those efforts would be ignored, or they would be dismissed or discounted. So I would think that you would want to do, at least in these places where views have hardened over the course of decades, I think that the role of primary and secondary socialization would be crucial. Central Asia is not like that. I know you wanted me to talk about other contexts. I think that nothing has particularly hardened in the context of Central Asia with regard to views of external actors. There are patterns, but I don't think that they're hardened in the same way as in these more extreme cases. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's what I've got.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
So we have there's still a bunch of questions in here, so maybe we can get through them tersely. So Sultanat asks, what are some implications of your research? And then I'll go through the next. Continue. You can address that.
Okay. Implications of the research. I'll just mention two things very briefly, because I do see there are a lot of questions. I'd love to try to get to most of them. Implications. One, there is room for maneuver on messaging and who the messenger is that can make a difference. Number one. Number two, slow-moving changes can become significant changes, right? If we have the long view, then I think we have the potential to see these how frankly U.S. foreign policy can be self-defeating, right? If you're trying to, or not, as the case may be, but I think the story can show. The story here shows that some of the more subtle changes can become over the longer haul, the more significant ones. So I think those would be two sort of major kinds of implications. And the third one, sorry, Sultanat, third one, if you'll allow me, is just broadly a suggestion that the way people behave, the way people mobilize, the way people maybe engage in politics is not simply a function of local circumstances, though it is significantly a function of that. It's also a function of images and processes that can travel a great distance, right? Just because the U.S. was, the U.S. was hegemonic, but it was a hegemon from a distance, right? But that great distance, I think, nonetheless, didn't mean that it didn't have an impact across Central Asia. And this is the story that I kind of want to chart out.
So Nerdana says, did you consider the difference between the attitude of news report actors and the actual attitude of the public, as there might be a distrust of public towards the government records and information presented in official news channels?
So what I showed you was a charting out. These were Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which has its own bias and so on, but it's a fairly systematic accounting of, or an attempt to be systematic in its coverage of former Soviet space. So that's one thing that we did. The other thing that we did is we took 3 newspapers from each of the countries, local newspapers, a Russophone newspaper, a Turkic language, or in Tajikistan, a Tajik language news source, and both state-owned and then one private one, right? And we charted the change over time across these different kinds of news sources. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. It does it, but I do think that the more that you begin to see the similar kinds of patterns across different media sources, the more likely that something is going on. So given the difficulty of conducting public opinion polls, and there's some decent ones, but I would say that certainly for the 1990s and early 2000s, there wasn't a lot going on in the public opinion polling era or area, and so this seemed to me to be a better strategy.
So Zarina says, thank you for the lecture. I'm really curious how you interact with the public sentiments on issues of gender, sexuality in Central Asia, as any movements in these spheres are mostly considered and as American propaganda, also thanks to Russian media portrayals.
Okay, how I'm trying to wrap my brain around that one. So how I'm trying to pull it up here. I don't see it.
Zarina.
Yeah, there's Zarina. Okay. Public sentiments and issues of gender and movements in these spheres are considered American propaganda. I think that's certainly become the case, right? That discourse of American propaganda on LGBTQ, issues, on sexuality, gender issues, that's become, the most visible, most sort of palpable discourse across the region. I think in part for the reasons that you just described here. It doesn't really come up as much in this book, in part because most of the data go through about 2014, 2015. Doesn't mean it wasn't there. One of the things that we did, focus groups, we deliberately had female focus groups because we were interested in trying to create environments in which women specifically could talk about the views of how they locate themselves in a geopolitical kind of sense. We didn't bring up specifically issues of sexuality or sexual rights and these kinds of things. I think indirectly it would come up with the human rights activists, but the wisdom generally was that was kind of part of the human rights thing. It didn't need to be separated from thinking about rights more generally. I think since more recently it's become a bit of a contentious issue, as you well know. What was I going to say? The one area in which it does come up organically is in some of the discourse among Islamist actors, right, who want to decry, moral decadence and want to place that at the, doorstep of American power, right? So moral decadence, degeneration of family values, and you can see where this leads, right, to discourses that are critical. But again, it wasn't really singled out. It was sort of more lumped together as kind of a general critique of moral decadence, with the U.S. as the main driver of that decadence, as they saw it, right?
So next we have Dilyara. Thank you. What were the ethical considerations of your read each concerning the fact that you look through Islamist movements and human rights activists? The other question is, where can we get access to read the book?
Oh, sorry, I think you froze for a little bit, or I did.
It's me, probably. So maybe you want to read.
Yeah, Brian did, yeah.
My internet's a little unstable.
Okay, let me try to
maybe
pull
you
up
want
the
to read
question.
the Dilyara, the next question, yeah.
what I tended to find sort of in terms of research ethics. I mean, I would emphasize that I didn't have any meetings with members of the IMU. Let's just start there, right? I did not, and my family was very happy that I had no interest in meeting with militants, right? I did have interviews with Hizb ut-Tahrir activists, and this was really before the broadside by governments against Hizb ut-Tahrir. So it was, it was illegal, but kind of tolerated in Kyrgyzstan. It was illegal, but not really tolerated in Tajikistan. But I think the regime didn't have the capacity to do anything about it. It was illegal, but not, but somewhat tolerated in Kazakhstan. I think that changed pretty dramatically. But I mean, Hizb ut-Tahrir activists were pretty unapologetic about how they viewed the world. They thought of themselves as, first of all, not a political movement. I might dispute that claim, but we're not a political movement. We're a pietist movement. We basically believe that, we just want to change people to become good Muslims. We don't believe in participating in in elections or in the, human political institutions, because that's not what is required for change. All we need to do is change Muslims into good practicing Muslims, right? And then the rest will somehow naturally follow. A weirdly utopian kind of view of the world, sort of almost with lots of echoes of fairly naive versions of Marxist philosophy, right? If we simply just believe, then the rest will follow. Who knows what Islamic governance will look like, but we know that if we believe in our hearts, it will happen. Anyway, well, all this meant that they didn't see anything problematic with talking to somebody from the West. They didn't think how others in the room might have experienced similar kinds of things. In fact, they thought that because they were in the right, that they wanted to get their message out as broadly as possible. So, and I didn't see any ethical issues speaking to them. I'm not sure where the question was going. Islamic Renaissance Party as well. I mean, one of the things there is, especially because we know the fate of the party and activists who have been, and their families, right, who've been systematically repressed since then. One of the considerations might have been, does meeting with a foreign research scholar endanger somebody on the ground? And I think that's a real concern that we all need to take seriously. I don't think, I mean, in retrospect, we can say maybe there was more danger than we expected, but at the same time, I don't think that there was anything on the horizon that we could have reasonably seen to talk to activists who actually, like the Hizb ut-Tahrir folks, were really keen to get their message out, right? Especially as they found shrinking space for their own maneuver locally in Tajikistan. I think Ellen will agree that they were more than happy to speak to foreigners. Did that become a liability for them? And so would it have been more ethical to not interview them as to not draw the attention of the authorities? Maybe in retrospect, but I think that would have been hard to know in advance. So I'm not sure where the question about ethics was going, but my basic principle on research ethics is, I think what it should be for everybody, honestly, which is not just do no harm, but try to do good, right? And so if I had any whiff that I was putting anybody into danger, I would have avoided that.
Okay, so two things real quick. We've just kind of we're about almost 10 minutes over, but if everyone's okay with that, I'm fine to stick around. If you have to go and you want to just pick a couple questions that you want to ask, I leave it to your discretion. Secondly, I got booted off, and so I lost the whole chat line. So I am flying blind now, so I have to entirely rely on you, Ed, to moderate your own questions.
Sorry, just unmuting myself. I'm let me pull up the chat and see what now I've lost the chat. Okay, there it is. Okay. I'm trying to figure. So these came in order, right? So I guess Islam. Okay. I am Gould. More types of interviews. What obstacles face? in doing interviews. So yeah, just briefly on that. And again, I try to discuss it in the methods section of the book. I've always thought that the best interviews are, in a way, the more flexible kinds of interviews. It's possible that if you're doing a project where you're interviewing a certain type of person, then you can approach that systematically and use kind of the same questions in the same order, and that might make some sense. But given the kind of actors that I was interested in talking to, really varied in their social location, in their social political ambitions, in their own personalities, my view is always, and probably always will be, to be honest, to take my cues from them as to what they're comfortable talking about, how they want to talk about it. And frankly, if they don't want to talk about things, then that's fine too, right? If they just want to talk about the Bundesliga and then call it a day, that's completely fine with me, because I'd rather, I follow Leanne Fuji on this, who has a terrific book on interviewing. I'd rather treat them as somebody with whom I have some kind of relationship first, than to think of them as, an interviewee first, right? So to me, it's more important to treat them as a human being. So that's the kind of starting point for doing interviews. Now I lost where I was. So that was I am good. Donna graph. What might factors have caused the negative trend in 1995? So she asks, what happens in 1995? I kind of punted on that question of, I said there are no particular events. So the explanation that I give in the book is one that is more about overblown expectations about the prospect for political, social, economic change and prosperity, frankly, that end up becoming, I'm going to say hi to my son. Hello, son. That end up becoming dashed fairly quickly, right? And so by 1995, you do begin to see voices that are really quite critical of the United States and all the promises that it seemed to offer. And the US didn't, by the way, shy away from any of this stuff, right? There's nothing that it did to suggest that it's not, the paragon of virtue, the very model for, polity and economy that is universally applicable to everyone around the globe. And the implication here, remember this discourse that some of you in the room will remember, we just want to be a normal country, right? A normal country meant a prosperous, free country, right, on the mold of that the United States was at least nominally peddling. And there's nothing wrong with that. The problem was that it was always a bit unrealistic. It was always overblown. And so I think that, the story that I tell in the book is one of essentially dashed expectations, though those expectations were probably too high at the outset. So there's that. Jaras, the graph. Oh, okay. So Jaras wants to know what's going on in the graph. No, the attitudes are not homogeneous. And I, won't bore you with that. But one of the things that I do, so that's just an average. It's a quarterly average of attitudes expressed in that quarter based on the events, on the news items that appear. Okay, Murad Biek, did the USSR collapse affect the behavior? I see. Murad Biek asks a great question. Did the Soviet collapse affect the behavior? Yeah, I in a way, that's what I was just saying a while ago. Did the Soviet collapse make a difference? Yes, what happens is the Soviet Union collapses, but really in its aftermath, the United States claims to be the paragon of virtue, claims to have a model. And that's the story that I think is anomalous. So it may be that what we see now, where sometimes attitudes are a little bit above, sometimes they're a little bit below, that's a more normal kind of pattern. So maybe the aberration is 1991 to 1994, 1995. Were gender groups included in social movements? Short answer is no. I did not. I mean, I tried to be on the lookout for how gender played itself out within the movements that I looked at, but I did not deal with gender as a specific kind of social movement. I could have done. I mean, you know, probably in the context of Kyrgyzstan. Okay. Could you do? Okay, Julius asked, can you use the concept of West rather than the United States? Yeah, that's actually a great point, or a great question. You know, when we sometimes there were things that are sort of Western in general that were coded, that we sort of interpreted as having something to do with the United States. Other times not. It really depended on the context. So sometimes if they were, you know, if the discussion was about European interactions with Central Asia, then, you know, then that was really not, that had nothing to do with the United States. But if the conversation was about the World Bank, if it was about the IMF, in some contexts, if it was about Israel, right, then we coded that as expressing some kind of attitude about the US, right? Because those are sort of linked in the discourse, but it depends on the context, right? And so we tried not to, I'm not a fan of doing these, you know, machine coding exercises, because I think that there's no way, or there's very little chance that you would be able to consider meanings in context. So great question. But if we were doing a, you know, a larger study going forward, I think that would be a terrific thing to look at, you know, parsing out, separating the West from, you know, from the United States, or even Japan, South Korea, right? China, Russia. I mean, you could do this in a variety of different ways. Things would get very, very complicated quickly, but I think that that's probably the best way to go. So, Brian, I tried to zip through what sorry if I missed anything.
That's great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So I guess we're over time, but if there's any last pressing issue that someone really needed to get out, now's your last chance. If not, then you know, let's thank our guest. You know, the virtual hand clap.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thanks everybody. As you can see from my background, I wish I were in Astana, or sorry, Nur Sultan. I may never go to Nur Sultan, but I will come to Astana. Or something like that. But in any case, I look forward to meeting some of you in person, and old friends. Great to see you as well.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Okay.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.